Hi, it's Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. It's the 10th anniversary of the publication of Clinton Cash. Was Shakespeare correct that the past is prologue? Well, we're going to discuss that today with a special guest. The co-host of this program, of course, is Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent. I think this is a big deal because I think had the politics of this story involved been inverted, the 10th anniversary of the publication of Clinton Cash would be something that like universities are talking about in a significant and culturally historic way.
Yeah.
As it is, it's you and me and Steve Bannon talking about it on a podcast. But
Exactly.
but here we are.
Well, we've got Steve joining us. Steve was the co-founder of GAI. He was the chairman of the organization when we released Clinton Cash in 2015. And a lot has changed. But Steve, we wanted to dissect, go back a little bit in 2015, those sort of hurried days, a time when the Washington Post and the New York Times and Bloomberg and all these news outlets would readily take accurate information about politicians on the left and run those stories. And that's completely changed now. But let's begin, first of all, what's your immediate recollection of Clinton Cash in 2015 and what happened and how chaos broke loose?
Well, it was you came up with the idea years before, and it was pretty amazing the research you and the team did to actually get to pull it together. That's why the book was so powerful. Just remember 10 years ago, so it's the 10th anniversary. It's also we're within a couple of weeks, within 4 weeks, I think, of Trump coming down the escalator in 2015. And then the idea of making it into a film. So this all dovetailed together for this incredible presidential run. But you came up with the idea years before. And really, I think the first time somebody tried to knit together how these NGOs and all these not-for-profits are inextricably linked with government operations, with government, and the ability for these, quote unquote politicians, these globalists, to make just an incredible amount of money and to do a tremendous amount of harm. So even before Davos, and I think when I did Generation Zero, I had a section that called the Party of Davos, which was about you and your research. So no, this was and obviously later, over a year later, this became probably the most significant weapon we had of exposing Hillary Clinton and really that incredibly climactic run for the presidency in 2016. So this is a very important book, but more importantly, even the book is what the research and all the efforts you guys did to pull this together and really expose it to the American people.
But I would think, Steve, one of the legacies of the book is not just the power of honest and investigative journalism, but what the media's reaction has been to it and how I don't know that a book like Clinton Cash could be made again to expose a leftist politician. Because think about what you just said. Donald Trump 10 years ago was still coming down the escalator. His candidacy was being sneered at and derided. The only reason, in fact, if you go back and as we have done, MSNBC is like, no, it's okay that we're doing this Clinton Cash book because we were going to do an expose on whom. They weren't worried about Donald Trump. They were worried about Jeb Bush. We did a book about Jeb Bush's politics. Yes. But then Donald Trump becomes this person, and you obviously have done a lot of interviews, talked about the media strategy. But I guess is not the legacy that the media is no longer interested in reporting on something that's critical of any other politician if that reporting can in turn be seen as beneficial to Donald Trump?
Well, yes, but you remember the ecosystem's changed a lot in 10 years. Now, because of Clinton Cash and what it showed and getting research and getting out there, we can multiply this on the right so much. Trump, just to put it in perspective, they had just finished CPAC in 2015. I tell people all the time, they don't believe it. It's CPAC, which, Peter, you remember, it's happened, I think, a month before the book came out, because at CPAC, we were starting to launch, the book. You were starting to do the rounds. We were starting to get this thing rolling. In 2015 at CPAC, Trump finished 7th with 3% of the vote.
Right.
He was in 7th place the day he came down the escalator. He was in 7th place. So Trump was not, he was top of mind for us, but was not top of mind. The called shot here was Clinton. And I don't think, look, the media is always going to cover for these guys. I think this kind of, Brent Bozell's done so much great work on that. The guys at MRC. I don't ever think we got to depend upon the media to do it. The thing about Peter's reporting and eventually started getting picked up on like 60 Minutes and things like that is that the investigations are so bulletproof because you can't make any mistake. It's so detailed. The details are so horrifying, and then you just realize the media has been covering for this. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent of the Biden incapacity story for the 3 or 4 years of Biden's regime, that the media could see it right there in front of them and just kind of covered it up. So I think, to me, the lesson is, if you do the work, particularly now with the internet, and back then internet news was just really starting to catch on to a mass scale. If you do the work, people will find the story. And once they find it, the Clintons, couldn't run away from this. And eventually it was a major element in getting the Bernie bros, that element of the Bernie bros that came and supported us. Because remember, we won by 42,000 votes in Pennsylvania, I think 20,000 in Michigan, 10,000 in Wisconsin. It was about 72,000 votes. Not an insignificant part of that in piercing the blue wall were Bernie bros who, having read the book or heard Peter's thing and then seen the amazing film that was made, was put up on YouTube for free, had second thoughts and said, I can't support this because this is the corruption that is the worst, because it's corruption using money that should go to poor people and really exploit them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing to me, right, is corruption is one of those great issues that can cut both ways. But Steve, I kind of look back in 2014, 2015, we went around and met with media outlets. We met with the New York Times, the Washington Post. I remember you and I sat down with the senior people at ABC News.
Wow.
And I guess looking back now, I sort of wonder, why did they do it? Why do you think? I mean, let's remember, you had the New York Times.
They did it. No, they did it because your facts, people don't realize, we spent hours and hours with the top investigative teams of all the different groups. And because your evidence, I remember, what about the one about Eric Holder during the Biden thing? We had a cover of Newsweek, of which they shifted at the last second. The reason is that apparatus can't seem like they're ever agreeing with or accepting, particularly at that time, information and data that was generated by someone that was conservative. And you've always been known as a straightforward, you're a conservative, hardcore conservative, but you've never come across as a partisan. I come across as, I'm a hardcore partisan, and I admit that. But we engage with the top, I mean, New York Times, ABC Television News, with the guy Ross was running the group at the time, but every top, and we get so far down the road, and some came through, but almost every time they would wave off or not stick the landing, because they understood to do that would expose these leftist politicians for the total phonies and frauds they are, and doing that expose the entire system.
Well, you remember the New York Times ran that 4,000-word front-page piece on Uranium One, and then about a week later, Eric, you brought this up, they ran, I think it was the ombudsman of the paper, ran this article saying it was inappropriate to have this sort of quote-unquote special arrangement.
Yeah, it was actually like the next day. The New York Times, because the internet news may still have been early, but people still could email and they say, wait, what are you guys doing? With whom? And Margaret O'Sullivan writes that the description of this exclusive arrangement and the suggestion it contains the Times made a deal to stay away from certain storylines is troubling. Any agreement limiting journalistic inquiry is unacceptable. I believe Mr. Purdy did not let that thing happen here, but the Times merely pursued the angle it was most interested in with no restrictions, but she concludes it. But I still don't like the way it looked.
She's, by the way, Peter, she's one of the ones that we credit. She's like had 5 nervous breakdowns in the last 10 years. Right. That was the beginning of her.
We shouldn't have laughed at that. That's not a thing to laugh at, Steve. Say that again. We need to react in a different way to that.
I mean, not real nervous breakdowns, but public nervous breakdowns about this thing. She's one of the great. She's one of the great Trump haters in the world. But that was the beginning of her road to Damascus, right there, when she saw the paper of record, all the news that's fit to print. Her New York Times actually deal with facts that were generated by the research team of Government Accountability and Peter Schweizer.
Well, here's the other thing, too, is like it wasn't just the New York Times, though that story was massive. And obviously there's a lot of reporting, a lot of focus on the fact that the New York Times did cover this, and that kind of lent the story some credibility, and it allowed, I think, to your point, the Bernie bros wouldn't necessarily embrace a story by Peter Schweizer, but they would embrace a story by the the New York Times. But ABC News also came to your defense because the Clintons started to push back in a big way about the Haiti piece of it and how you had this Irish billionaire. He'd sold a bunch of cell phones and he's paying for speeches for Bill Clinton. And as ABC News reported, because we got really nervous for a minute, they said, well, some of the speeches that were paid or unpaid may have been conflated. But the larger fact pattern that somebody who's getting money from the State Department and making money off of this rebuild and the Haiti earthquake is paying Bill Clinton a ton of money. That's true. And that, from there, it was just like no looking back. And now it's not about us. It's like, wait, how is your brother on the dang board of a gold mining company in Haiti? How come you guys are making money off of cell phones? And I tell you, like, the power of it is real. But Steve, part of the reason why I want to have this conversation is the legacy of Clinton Cash is, I think you can connect the dots between, you mentioned the Biden cognitive decline story being ignored. I think the Hunter Biden laptop story was also ignored for exactly this reason. Like, here's another story. It might be true, but it's not worth reporting on if it's ultimately beneficial to this person that we hate.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was, in fact, the same thing with Peter. I was an expert in the China situation. So Rudy and Costello called me up there in July. I saw it, and for 20 minutes you could go through and see it was all real. That was definitely suppressed, and of course the intelligence community came out. But it's an important lesson there is that we knew at the time that all of it was factually correct. It wasn't a Russian op. And Rupert Murdoch's, in fact, the reason we went with the New York Post is Murdoch's team at the New York Post that have been through so many things like this really drilled down and saw it. But it also reminds me of Peter. Peter, I don't think in any of those efforts, and this was dealing with all the different top research teams of the mainstream media, whether it was broadcast or print. And I don't believe it ever came back and questioned a fact after they did their own, a fact that you brought up. It was just like the laptop from hell. And you've got to, I remember you used to say, hey, we have to double and triple check every fact, because they're just looking for one fact to be wrong to say, well, this is a bunch of conspiracy theory guys, a bunch of right-wing kooks. That's why I think Clinton Cash stands up over time. And look at some of the issues today, particularly with uranium. Some of the issues brought up in Clinton Cash have not been resolved today. Everything from the Haitian situation to the uranium. So I think it shows that the power of actually doing the work is what wins out at the end.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate that, and we do take our research very seriously. And I think that it benefited from the fact that we had this strategy from the beginning. We talked about it, where we said, look, we can hold this all in the book and release the book, or we can actually pick some mainstream media partners and we can share with them and say, look, do the research yourself. Here's all the footnotes. Here's all the endnotes. So that took a certain level of trust on our part, thinking that these people were actually going to deliver, and they did. I wouldn't do that today. I wouldn't do that today because I think back then there was at least some semblance of feeling like they had to cover things on both sides of the aisle. That's gone. And I think one of the reasons it's gone is because they saw the wreckage of the Clinton campaign as a result of this book. I read through, somebody had mentioned it to me, Steve, Bill Clinton's memoir that came out in the fall called Citizen. And he has, you'll appreciate this, he has 1,500 words in that book on Clinton Cash. And he basically says that Clinton Cash and Jim Comey and the emails is what cost Hillary the election. I think Trump probably had something to do with that too. But that's what cost him the election. And Bill Clinton couldn't sleep for years because of the legacy of it. So the media can't be trusted anymore. I didn't quite trust them that much before, but you can't trust them all. You couldn't replicate what we did in 2015 anymore today.
But I don't know, two things there. Number one, and I've always said this, 16, because it was such a come from behind. And that's what, remember, the movie that reinvigorated the book came out in late July, early August, and it got millions of hits, particularly Bernie Bros. And Eric, I do think that there's an aspect of Bernie Bros with a guy like Peter Schweizer and his reporting we're open to it. And in fact, it just was in the New York Times or somebody's a cover. So Clinton lost that as much as we wanted. I mean, obviously Trump with the amazing come from behind, hitting the issues, just relentless, up piercing the blue wall, which is what did it for us, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which was looked at as a long shot. But in those areas, particularly the Clintons, because remember, the Clintons had always had a kind of a blue collar working class audience. Is the way she came back against Obama. It's what they kept him in power in Arkansas. That totally turned on them. And so she as much lost it as we wanted. Clinton Cash was a huge part of that because they started seeing her as a phony. I think much more than Comey. I always thought the Comey email thing was always tangential. It was their corruption, venality, all of that. The reason also today is you don't need it, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it, but you don't need it. Back then, you remember, you guys had this theory of the case that we were going to come out obviously in conservative sites, but you had to have the air cover of the mainstream media. That's why you work so hard with the mainstream media to show them these are the facts. And actually, some of these guys just covered it, and it picked up so much of your material that took us to the next level. Today, with the ecosystem of the of the different podcasts and particularly social media, you don't need it. Your work comes out, your latest work, the Chinese, everything like that, you come out, you don't even need really cable TV for it. It just comes out and the work stands on its own. It gets great social media hits pushed out, and that's how people absorb it. So the world's changed dramatically in 10 years. The media, and that's why the media today, the mainstream media, is not the kingmakers they used to be. If they were the kingmakers, Kamala Harris would be president, or Joe Biden would be in his his second failed term. So I think it's just been a huge sea change over the last decade.
But I think the reason why they aren't kingmakers anymore is because they have lost the trust of those blue-collar voters that you're talking about, and I know that you've helped step in that void. Listen to what Chuck Todd said on, talk about the podcast Echo Chamber. He was on Pod Save America. Listen to what Chuck Todd basically admitted in terms of the lack of reporting and why certain stories, specifically Biden's cognitive decline, how it would have been handled differently in a different context.
The idea that somehow the media was all in cahoots is just nonsense. Now, I know how this happened. You know how this happened. Everybody's personal interaction with Biden was good enough when you thought the alternative was Donald J. Trump. And if everybody had been asked the same question and Nikki Haley was the person standing over there, there'd have been a chorus of Democrats who would have said he can't run for re-election.
I mean, that's them basically admitting that if Donald Trump's not the opponent, Biden, the biggest scandal in maybe modern American political history, would have been more fairly reported. I mean, how do you come back from that if you're part of that left echo chamber?
I mean, I don't think they are coming back from it. I think that's people have seen how it's not just manufactured what they do. It's also not very good. It's not very interesting. It's not very exciting. It's just not good. It's just a failed product. So no, I don't think they come back. I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out what comes next, right? What comes next because now it's one thing, Peter, as you know, to be, which we were for years at Breitbart with government accountability. These things were set up to be kind of revolutionary groups, not so much even against the Democrats, but the Republican establishment. And so we've had this for 10 years, this revolutionary movement, this populist nationalist movement. Now, and you see, we're going through the difficulties. Then how do you get that to? We know we can win at the ballot box a majority of folks in an increasing kind of 1932 coalition. It's how do you govern? And I think that our media has got to be better. We have to make sure that we're not just falling in line and making the same mistakes they make. We got to be very fair about what President Trump, I mean, our show's a huge platform for it. But like we had MTG on the other day who says, hey, I think some of these things are losing the base. We had Tom Fenton, your buddy Tom Fenton, Peter, and you're good to know Tom Fenton has sued the Trump administration 12 times. Yeah. It's almost like back to the Obama days. So I think it's incumbent on us to figure out the model going forward to make sure that we are truth tellers and we're giving it straight to the American people, which I think they will embrace.
Yeah, I think one of the big myths that the media has kind of pushed out is that the Trump movement and the movement that he represents is kind of this personality driven, and that Trump can do whatever he wants. Yeah, there are some people that are going to do that because they don't have a deep, rich understanding of American history or what goes on in the world. But I think a lot of people who sort of champion the reform agenda of Trump want to hold him accountable too, because we understand issues of corruption. It can happen to anybody. It's part of our fallen human nature, and they think that accountability. But Steve, on the question of the media, don't we need, maybe I'm just an old guy pining back for the old years. Don't we need a newspaper or a source of information that, is kind of liberal, but they try to at least adhere to some kind of accurate reporting? Because today a lot of people wonder, where do I actually go to get a summation? Don't we need something like that? I remember the story you told me when you were on Wall Street. You used to carry the Financial Times around, and you used to read the New York Times regularly. I don't really read the Times regularly anymore. It's gotten so bad. But don't we need something like that?
My Financial Times is right here. I have a huge stack of them right here. No, it's my prop, right? Today's FT. But no, it's shocking to me, actually, how many leaders of the conservative movement, politics, business, don't read the New York Times and don't really read the Financial Times. I say it's imperative. I mean, I start every day by reading The Guardian and all the left wing. You can't really understand their mindset until you read it and see what they're, because it's all narrative war, right? Yeah. You have to understand that. So I'm pretty shocked by that. I do. In fact, Peter, I was talking today to some people had come, and I said, I picked up, because I get all the printed papers here in the war room every day, about 6 or 7 of them. It's amazing in DC. And I picked up the Washington Times, and I love the Washington Times. I've read it for years. It's one of my favorite papers. But, they've put up over $1 billion into the Washington Times. If you go back when you start, the Washington Times started during the Reagan administration. And I don't think it's ever broken a profit because they put out a print edition. They put over $1 billion into the Washington Times. We definitely need, I think, a paper of record on the right. I have hoped it's been and they're tough to do, particularly with the cost of a paper today. The New York Sun took a shot at it back in the early 2000s. I thought that was terrific. They still are online. So I think you need to do it more than online. I would love to have a printed broadsheet that actually did that. The Epoch Times is probably the closest. I think that's a terrific paper. I love what these guys do as far as reporting. So that's probably, and it's number 4 as far as, I think it's just in back of the New York Times, the Journal, and I think the Washington Post as far as online, people actually paying for it online. So no, I absolutely agree. I also think we need magazines. I think we need more websites. The problem with the podcast that I see, a lot of it's a little too chatty and informal. I think some of that's great. And obviously they have huge audiences of how information gets out there. But, the Clinton Cash type of information, because remember, we had this thing at Breitbart too, and at the GI, not punditry. You wanted facts, lead with the stories. The stories will drive it. And that's why Clinton Cash was not punditry. People don't realize this. I think you went back to her schedule. Remember, you had tied it like to her schedule when meetings were off the books. The research was so definitive. And this is why they never put up a fight. They just try to avoid it. That's what you need on the right today. If we continue to do that and more groups pop up, I think we're going to be in fine shape. But the whole media ecosystem on the right is all kind of in a formation stage right now, given the big victory we had in November. And we're going to have to see how this thing, I think, kind of sorts itself out.
So the strategy that we used was to take all the facts and all the information from Clinton Cash, give them to the mainstream media outlets, and then allow the right side websites to then report on what the New York Times and the Washington Post was doing. We called it Anchor Left, Pivot Right, and you've given interviews to Joshua Green, and he sold a lot of books based on the very smart strategy that we employed. My question, Steve Bannon, is, are you potentially guilty of allowing people like Gavin Newsom to now do the opposite, right? When you go on Gavin Newsom's podcast, is he attempting to anchor right and then kind of pivot left? And what's your take on this effort on his part to kind of court white males by trying to have those people on, and because I think they're trying to learn, what's attractive to them, what appeals to them, and do you feel like ultimately that's beneficial to just have a national conversation, or do you? Yeah. Some people are critical, but they think, you're kind of giving them away the answers.
Yeah, I think it's imperative for us not to just stay in our shell, but to get out. Because one thing I can tell you, the more people focus on populist economics, and the more they think about economic nationalism and what's really at stake here, the more adherence we get. You saw that in 2024 with African American males coming to our side, Hispanic families, Hispanic males. The more we promulgate this message, the more people we're going to get. That's why I do Gavin Newsom and Bill Maher and Stephen A. Smith. I'm doing, and every week now I'm going to do 2 or 3 of these to get this word. I'm doing the Financial Times at the Kennedy Center on Saturday. And it'll be a pretty hostile audience, but that's what I love. And you got to get that word out. They are also, look, they're all doing it for their own. They're trying to increase their audiences. They're trying to increase their reach. Gavin Newsom's particularly interested in that. You have the governor's bracket in 28. You have the governor's bracket of Westmore and Brashear and Shapiro and Whitmer and all these governors running big states. And from the Democrats' perspective, doing a good job. His California model is so failed. He can't run. He's not going to run the California model. He's going to pivot and go into what I call the celebrity bracket, of AOC and Mara Pete and Mark Cuban and Stephen A. Smith. And I think Populist will jump in there too with Newsom and others. And so he's clearly, they're all using you. Remember, everyone's using you to get more reach and try to get our audience and get people to get access. You just have to make sure that you go in and you kind of know what your objectives are. My objectives, it kind of blew me away. He didn't push back on anything on populism, including, making fun of Pocahontas and talking about the 2020 election being stolen. I'm kind of sitting there going, okay, if this is what it's going to be, let's just roll. So, but I think it's imperative. This is why I always admired about Peter. Peter was very adamant about in Winton, who was kind of our chief operating officer and thinking it all through. It was never to go to the easy audiences. It was always to go. You wanted this stuff out in the New York Times. You wanted that 4,000 word story. You wanted to be on ABC. You wanted to be one of the best we ever did. And it is as current as it happened yesterday. Peter was the first guy to come up with and say, hey, these law firms are actually not law firms anymore. They're actually connective tissue of Wall Street, the political class. They're beyond just fixers. They're kind of the interconnective, not tissue, but the interlinking locks that tie all this together. And these big law firms in D.C. are really they're all operatives, and the worst is Covington and Burling. And Eric Holder is not just a radical attorney general for Obama. He's kind of like a mob boss, and we're going to do it. They did this story that literally is the same thing that President Trump is making the case against Paul Weiss. It's got to be 10 or 12 years ago. And it was going to be on the cover of Newsweek magazine up until the final edit. And they had a fist fight. I think Peter Boyer was right. They had a fist fight in the editing room around the table, screaming at each other. They, at the last second, said, we can't put this out. This is kind of like so real. Yeah. This exposes everything. They shifted it out for a thing of like a baby of, I don't know, genetics or something. That was an interesting story, but it had no riz to it. It had no purpose to go. I think it had the worst sales of any magazine that year for Newsweek. And the reason our story was buried about 3/4 of the way through the paper, and it was so explosive. What Peter and Winton always demanded is that we weren't going to take the easy route to just play to our own audience and give this, but you had to go. The whole thing of GAI was to do this work that was at a quality and a pristine nature that it could never be questioned. The facts would be the facts, and you would eventually force yourself into the blood system of the mainstream media. Now, little did they know that Peter Schweizer had it teed up that this was a bacillus, right? getting into the blood system.
Yeah, no, it was pretty amazing. And I think one of the other things that was remarkable at that time too is we've been talking about the book. You mentioned the documentary film. And by the way, that documentary film in 2016 had more than 3 million hits. And if I remember correctly, some of the Bruni bros outside of the Democratic convention,
they had a screening,
put a big screen. They had it in the courtyard outside the screen. And let's not forget, there was a graphic novel, the Clinton Cash graphic novel. And the great thing about that, by the way, is the graphic novel was #1 on the New York Times list for graphic novels. And then a month later, they got rid of that category. The New York Times never again rated so.
No. It's like O'Sullivan went to him and go, you got to get rid of this category, right? Her head was blown up so much. Actually, we have the art when you walk in the war room, which is in the old Breitbart Embassy. We actually have the art from that graphic novel, which is so magnificent. I mean, it's absolutely stunning, the whole thing. I say this all the time about Bernie, and I talk to some of Bernie's biggest donors, and I agree 1,000%. In both shots, but particularly that first one that he had of Clinton, he never brought up any of this stuff. That's why the Bernie bros embraced the film. They go, where the hell was this? Why didn't you get up in their face about this in the primary? If Bernie Sanders had embraced the corruption of the Clintons and the globalists overall and connected or just took the dots that we connected, Bernie Sanders would have been the nominee. Of that, there's no doubt. He had 2 shots of the Clintons, and both times they were pillow fights, right? so he didn't. It's like Mike Lindell sponsored his campaign. No, it's a joke. The Bernie bros loved it because this is what they want Bernie to do. This is what if you're going to be a populist on the left, if you don't attack this all the time of the corruptions of these globalists and these global corporatists, it's totally performative. And that's quite frankly, I think, why Bernie is. And the Bernie bros, to a degree, embraced the film, got more into the details of the book, made it a huge hit. And that's the difference in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. That was the difference.
Yeah, no, that's hugely fascinating. One other issue Eric brought up, which I frankly forgot about, Steve, is that Clinton Cash comes out, and that becomes kind of the seed basis for the Russia collusion charge against Trump. Walk through that briefly, Eric, what that genealogy was.
Well, and I appreciate the time, but basically when you have reporting, and the Columbia Journalism Review has validated and built on this, but the reporting in Clinton Cash basically accused Hillary of helping Russia acquire U.S. uranium assets and making money off of that through donors of the Clinton Foundation, and Bill Clinton got $500,000 to give a speech at the Kremlin, basically. They knew they had a problem being perceived as a Russian asset, so they fabricated the Russiagate hoax, and they tried to turn it around and say, no, Donald Trump is the Russian agent. They hired Mark Elias, who's a Hillary Clinton campaign attorney, and they hired a bunch of other people. And the people that then, I mean, this is how broken journalism was. The people who reported on the fake Russia story won journalism awards.
Yeah. It's pretty, it's pretty remarkable.
Eric, I think that's absolutely brilliant. I think it's absolutely brilliant. That's why I would like to have a formal investigation or Crossfire Hurricane. I think it's incumbent. I keep saying 2020, the election, the pandemic, this whole thing. I spent personally $2.5 million of my own money in defense for the Mueller Commission, the House Intelligence, which Paul Ryan basically turned over to Shifty Schiff and Eric Swalwell, and then the Senate Intelligence. I have over, I think, 60 hours of sworn testimony of where they're always just trying to get you into a perjury trap. I mean, I had Bill Burke and Alex Spiro, I think the 2 best lawyers in the country, and they charge accordingly. The reason I hired them, it was a series. These guys were coming after us for all this made up stuff, and it didn't matter. I think your analysis is quite frankly brilliant. This is why I keep calling for, instead of talking about it on podcasts, and we got to have a formal investigation on this. This cuts to the heart. When people say the deep state, I say, I don't think it's a deep state. It's up in your grill. And you tie all this together with the laptop from hell, it shows you. And this is one of the reasons we're every day on the show, we're talking about President Trump. We have to have a bigger sense of urgency about how we're going after the deep state here, because we're just not. And we're burning daylight. And there's so many things that the American people need to see and needs to be put forward in some sort of investigative formal apparatus or venue that the American people can see what the facts are.
Well, I would just say this. I mean, I think that's the legacy of Clinton Cash. That's why we wanted to do this podcast. Is why we wanted to have you on. Is I do think you can connect the dots between the mainstream media reported on a real story It had a political impact that was unfathomable and unacceptable to them, and they said never again. That's why they ignored the Hunter Biden laptop store. That's why they ignored Joe Biden's cognitive decline. And I think if Donald Trump continues to be, so you're doing journalism a disservice, Steve, by talking up the idea of a Trump third term, because now they're going to ignore whatever the hell the next scandal is. If they think it's Nikki, you heard Chuck Todd, if they think it's Nikki Haley, like fine, we'll report on it. But if it's Donald Trump, they're not going to do it. But I will just say this: I appreciate the impact you've had in terms of getting information out. I remember very much we went to the Cannes Film Festival and we screened Clinton Cash in Cannes. And I remember seeing you, like here we are, the dang Mediterranean Sea. You could be out there getting a tan. I know you had some interactions with some Spanish reporters. We'll talk about that later. But the point is that you're sitting there and you're more excited to be talking to damn truckers in Ohio from Cannes, France. You're doing your Breitbart radio show with Alex Marlowe. But I think you understood that's where the electorate was. And I guess, what do you feel like you learned doing that show and talking to those people, and how did that kind of lead to what you're doing now?
Oh, that was everything. It was because it was a call-in show at the time on Sirius XM. Breitbart started Sunday night, then we got Saturday morning, and then we went daily. And it was just an experience. You can tell where the country was going. And on top of that, all the Breitbart reporting. People forget at the time in 2016 when Bannon and certain folks punched out when we had that incident. They had the incident with Corey down at Mar-a-Lago. I was accused of turning Breitbart into Trump Pravda, right? So no, the Sirius XM was an incredible experience because you just got feedback every day. What I really admired is that just like when I went to prison, when I got selected for the campaign on basically Saturday, the 13th of August, and talking to President Trump and the Mercers and other people, I'd finished the Saturday morning show, and I called Raheem and the team on Sunday, and Alex Marlowe said, "Hey, starting tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., it's yours. I'll see you. I'm going into the campaign." These guys hit the mark. Just like when I went to prison, I said, "Hey, it's next man up. I'm not going to talk to you guys. I'm not, I'm going to be in communication every day, but I'm not going to tell you what to do on the show. You just got to step into the breach and do it." That to me, it shows you we've got a movement that's building, and you're getting tremendous young people in here. But the feedback of the Breitbart audience, particularly the truckers, was instrumental, I think, in figuring out where people being able to read the room and seeing that President Trump, had a real shot. You add that to Brexit, to what happened in June of 26. Or June of 16, it all came together, and we're a long way from finished. As Peter will tell you, when I first started focusing on Trump, it was really, although I knew him not fairly well, but kind of through Dave Bossie from 10, it was really in 14 when he was polling at 0, and then in 2021 when I was the guy that said, "Hey, we got this. We just got to dig in here." He was, half of the MAGA movement left because they were so traumatized by the same election. I've had a lot longer shots than Trump 28, and President Trump will be the candidate in 28. He will win, and he'll be the president on the afternoon of January 20th, 2029. Of that, I'm more certain of that than I am when I jumped on and got, had his back in 14 and had his back again in 21. So this is hopefully the mainstream media's heads won't blow up too much as we progress on in this.
Well, that is a mic drop right there, Steve. We really do appreciate you making the time.
Guys.
10 years has flown by real fast.
Wow.
We encourage you to listen to Steve's podcast, subscribe to our podcast. You can find out more about our research at thedrilldown.com, and you can subscribe to our podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks
Eric,
again.
Eric, you keep getting younger. Peter, I don't know, man.
Hey, Steve,
Eric, you look amazing. Peter, you're kind of like me. No, I'm just kidding.
Hey, Steve, just remember this. When I first met you, you were just running a website, and now look at you. You're welcome.
Guys, take care. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye, guys.
Take care.